The research was an attempt to bring different perspectives to how schools do policy. The received view, the common view that politicians and evaluators take is that it's a linear, rational process, a straightforward move from policy ideas to practice. The research based on the entirely different premise that things are much more complicated than that. For example, that schools are not involved in a single implementation of a single policy at any point in time, but are actually coping with multiple demands which are often irreconcilable, create contradictions. So we're trying to understand both empirically and to theorize this complex process of juggling with, translating, interpreting, translating into practice the multiple demands of policy. The empirical focus was on 4 schools, an in-depth case study of each of those schools over a period of 27 months, just over 2 years. The schools were chosen as what we call ordinary schools. That they weren't schools that were struggling with underperformance, and they weren't schools that were exceptional in any way. They were schools around the national average of performance, because we wanted schools that were working in normal circumstances, nothing unusual about them. So we worked in those schools. We interviewed a cross-section of teachers and other people, for example, the school bursars, or the school managers as they're called now, who are often not part of research studies. We also attended meetings, briefings, some departmental activities, particularly the start of term events, and some in-service activities. Well, as I said, the research was attempting to make some empirical statements. So we were able to portray the complexity of the policy processes that go on in schools. But in addition to that, we were also trying to develop a conceptual model for these processes of policy implementation in schools. And indeed, we tried to move away from the idea of implementation to erase that concept, that descriptor, as being far too simple and misleading. And we developed the notion of policy enactment. So what we tried to do was to capture and portray the creativity and complexity of the processes that teachers and head teachers and department heads were involved in making sense of policy, making it into something that was relevant to the school, and making it something that was doable. So we talked about policy enactment as having 2 key elements to it. A process of interpretation where key figures, the head teacher, the senior leadership team, the heads of department, would be involved in saying, what does this mean? What does it mean to us? What do we have to do? Do we have to do anything, in fact? And how does it relate to what we call our institutional narrative, our history, our sense of what the school's about? The second move and the second aspect of this is what we call translation, which is then taking what is necessary, what needs to be done, and making it into something practical. And in that, teachers, different kinds of teachers play different kinds of roles in the practical translation of policy ideas into practice. And the central notion in this is that that process of translation is massively underestimated in the way policymakers think about schools. The translation of text, things written on bits of paper, into action in particular contexts, with particular students, particular buildings, particular sets of resources, particular limitations and opportunities, is an enormously creative process. So enactment is a creative, imaginative, demanding process. And that's what we tried to capture and portray. The basic message, I think, is that policy and policymakers fail to grasp the actual demands that policy make on schools. that they often focus on one policy at a time, whereas schools are focusing on many policies at the same time. They often, in the writing of policy, policymakers have in their minds a fantasy vision of the best of all possible schools. But most schools are not the best of all possible schools. They have particular resources, particular limitations. They have staff who may be very experienced or not. They may have students who are all mother tongue language speakers, or they may have a huge range of students with different mother tongues, different backgrounds and histories, and each of those differences bring new and different complexities into the process of making policy into practice. So what we were trying to do, more than anything else, is to make the process of how schools do policy more realistic.